Hello everyone and welcome back to Royalty Now. Today's subject is the very mysterious playwright and poet William Shakespeare. As always, we'll begin with his history, discuss the popular theory that he didn't write any of his own works, and then of course discuss what he might have looked like and reveal some recreations. Let's go ahead and get started. As we hinted in the introduction, we know both so much and so little about Shakespeare. It's really only thanks to his friends collecting and publishing his works after his death that his over 30 plays and 150 poems survive. So in a way, we know everything about the work and hardly anything about the man who wrote it. The actual records we have of where he was and what he was doing during his life are incredibly spotty, and they can only form a rough outline. We don't even have a single surviving letter written in his own hand. What we do know about his life comes mostly from mundane records, those of births, deaths, baptisms, marriages, and wills. So we have to try to piece his life together with what we have. Born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England, to humble beginnings, William Shakespeare was baptized on April 26, 1564. Now, baptisms traditionally took place 3 days after birth, so from this record we can assume that his birthday is April 23rd. His father John was a former glovemaker turned alderman for the crown, and his mother Mary Arden was a modest landholder coming from a lesser noble family that dated back 500 years. Although he would attend the local grammar school as a child, he actually never had any further education. In 1582, an 18-year-old William married a woman 8 years his elder from his neighborhood, and her name was Anne Hathaway. It's believed that this marriage was done in a hurry thanks to some rushed paperwork and the fact that their eldest daughter Susanna was born only 6 months after their wedding day. A few years later in 1585, Anne gave birth to twins, a boy named Hamnet and another daughter named Judith. Now, between 1585 and 1592, there's a blank spot in what we know he's doing. This is often referred to as his lost years. Historians have claimed him to be everything from a teacher to a horseminder during these years, and some even say that he was on the run from the law. It wasn't until he begins to be mentioned in the London theatre scene around 1593 that we really catch up with him. But he seems to have lived apart from his wife and family during these years. And the question here becomes why? While he would go on to own properties in Stratford where his family remained, he would never bring them to London with him when he was there for work. The only solid detail we have of his relationship with Anne, besides the fact that they lived apart for most of their adult lives, is that in his will he bequeathed her his second best bed. No one is sure exactly what this means or what she did not to deserve his best bed. Some scholars note that the second best bed could also just mean the marriage bed, since the best bed would have been reserved for guests, so even this detail just doesn't tell us much. Outside of these dates and mundane civil records, this part of his life is almost up to the imagination entirely. So who was the real Shakespeare? The lack of detail leaves us to try and fill in the gaps ourselves with what we do have, and that is his body of work. In 1594, William became a member of the theatre troupe called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, later called the King's Men. This company had a few things that made them special and made their performances the talk of London. First, they had the most talented actor of the time, Richard Burbage. But what they didn't yet realize is that they also had the man who would go on to become the best dramatist of all time, Shakespeare. The young Shakespeare, now in his early 30s, begins to write prolifically and even act in smaller roles. His early works are more stiff and conventional, they're comedies and historical plays. But later he begins to find more freedom in his verse and style, dabbling in the Machiavellian drama Richard III, while also writing his most slapstick of comedies, The Comedy of Errors. Sadly, in 1596, his son Hamnet died at the age of only 11. Scholars have noted darker themes in his plays after this event, and from 1599 to 1600, his writings explore things like deep sadness, aging, midlife crises, death, revenge, and lost identity, allowing us insight into the mind of Shakespeare that we don't get anywhere else. In his play King John, the character Constance has a poignant dialogue about grief, showing us Shakespeare's deep understanding of it. Grief fills up the room of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, repeats his words, remembers me all of his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then I have reason to be fond of grief. Despite their sadness, these plays would set Shakespeare apart. And in 1599, his theater company relocated to the newly constructed and prestigious Globe Theater. Shakespeare, two Burbage brothers, and others were investors in this property, and they began to receive generous profit shares when their plays did well. It's also here that he writes one of his most well-known plays, Hamlet, giving us the famous quote, "To be or not to be." This quote is an incredibly powerful soliloquy that deals with the character's struggle with suicide. At first, the character sees it as empowering to take action for himself, before realizing that he truly does not know what death is, and in reality, it could be even worse than his existence. Shakespeare's fame rose to new peaks, with even the monarch now enthralled. Queen Elizabeth I invited Shakespeare to perform for her, and loved it so much that he was asked to perform 5 more times. She would eventually grant a coat of arms for his family, indicating their respectability. Shortly before her death, she requested to watch A Midsummer Night's Dream one more time. She would die in the early morning hours of March 24th, 1603. We don't see him in the records again until the coronation of James I. We know that he would continue writing plays until 1613, but after this, not much is known. It appears that Shakespeare retired back to his home in Stratford in 1612, and it's here that he wrote a long and detailed will on March 25th, 1616, and died a month later on April 23rd, his 52nd birthday. He was buried in the chancel of the parish church in Stratford-upon-Avon, and his wife Anne was buried beside him upon her death in 1623. But unfortunately, that's the last of the recorded details we have. So what was his personality like? His friend and contemporary Ben Jonson said that Shakespeare's true personality could be felt by those who knew him in his poetry. He seemed to be a good friend, and he was held in high esteem by those who knew him. Fellow actors John Hemmings and Henry Condell collected Shakespeare's plays after his death and published them. Now commonly referred to as the First Folio, this very collection is considered one of the most influential books ever published. Now, I want to discuss the question of authorship, as this has become kind of a popular theory in recent years. There are theorists who believe that Shakespeare didn't write any of his own works, and that he was merely the figurehead for another ghostwriter, probably someone of higher rank that didn't want to associate with the arts. But this idea wasn't actually introduced until the late 1700s, and I can't say I'm totally convinced by it either. The reason why this notion has been able to flourish is due to the lack of documentation of the man himself, including hardly any details about his education. A cornerstone of the theory is that the wide array of detail that Shakespeare included in his stories, everything from royal history, the high aristocracy, geography, language, politics, could never have been known by a humble man from Stratford. Professor Jonathan Bates put it well. He said, "For over 200 years after Shakespeare's death, nobody questioned that Shakespeare, the man from Stratford, Shakespeare the player, was Shakespeare the writer. For 200 years, the question didn't occur to anybody. Nobody had any doubts. What then happened in the Victorian period is that there was a rather eccentric American lady called Delia Bacon who became convinced that Shakespeare couldn't have been Shakespeare, and that maybe someone called Francis Bacon, a famous writer, a famous politician, was Shakespeare. And she started finding out all these sorts of hidden codes that led her to believe that Bacon was Shakespeare." Other suggested figures who are the, quote, real authors behind his work include William Stanley, Christopher Marlowe, and Edward de Vere. The main point to refute this idea is that Shakespeare was well known in London during this time, and he had quite a lot of friends and work relationships. He's recorded as being a man from Stratford-upon-Avon, recorded as being an actor, and recorded as being a playwright. There are many tributes to him as an amazing writer during his lifetime. So, at its heart, any theory that he is not the author of his own plays implies that everyone in his life was either completely fooled by him or somehow in on the plot. He was an astute observer, akin to a reporter or a journalist, and I do believe that Shakespeare is the man who wrote his works. Despite how little we know, and maybe because of it, Shakespeare has absolutely occupied our imaginations for the last 400 years. His influence on our collective imagination truly cannot be overstated. Plays like Richard III, which paints the 15th century king as an evil, hunchbacked tyrant, has influenced our perception of him as a historical figure to this day. Stories similar to Romeo and Juliet pop up all over our collective consciousness, and his presence can even be felt in how we use certain words and language. Common phrases we use today like "seen better days," "too much of a good thing," "no rhyme or reason," and "in my heart of hearts" are all with us because Shakespeare made them up. He is a truly astounding figure of whom we know so much and so little. Shakespeare's good friend, the poet and dramatist Ben Jonson, said that Shakespeare was not of an age, but for all time. So, what did Shakespeare really look like? Unfortunately, his appearance is about as mysterious as his personality to us. Bill Bryson wrote a great summary of what we know about Shakespeare's appearance in his book, Shakespeare, The World is Stage. There are a few main contenders for the true likeness of Shakespeare, and these include portraits known as the Chandos portrait, the Droeshout engraving, and the effigy at his burial site. There are countless other Shakespeare-esque images out there, including one known as the Cobb portrait, but these are heavily argued about, and not a single one has been agreed upon. We also don't have a single description of Shakespeare from his lifetime. So the portrait I've worked from for my recreation is the Chandos portrait. This painting now resides at the National Portrait Gallery. The curator for the gallery, Dr. Tanya Cooper, lists a good amount of reasons for why the painting could be Shakespeare. First, the painting is from the correct time period to be Shakespeare. The clothing the subject is wearing was popular between 1590 and 1610, and that was the exact time when Shakespeare was having his greatest successes, and was therefore most likely to sit for a privately commissioned portrait. The gold earring he's wearing suggests kind of that bohemian appearance, which would be common for a playwright. And we can also tell that the subject is of reasonable wealth because of his all-black clothing, so black dye in large quantities was quite expensive, and you had to be somewhat wealthy to have it. Unfortunately, there's no provenance for this painting, but if it is Shakespeare, it would be the one and only likeness of him that was taken from life. So if the Chandos portrait is not Shakespeare, there are a few other possibilities. The first is the first folio image from 1623, and this is a copperplate engraving that first appeared as the front page of the collective works of Shakespeare. This was the folio that was published by his friends in 1623. This work is called the Droeshout engraving after the artist. Now, of course, by 1623, Shakespeare had been dead for 7 years, so it's certain that this was not created from life. And this piece of work has gotten a lot of flack over the years. Author Bill Bryson calls it a magnificently mediocre piece of work. Droeshout later in his life produced some really quality engravings, but this would have been made before he really honed his skills as an artist. This engraving is so off-kilter, it's so lopsided. One side of the hair is longer than the other, one eye is larger, the head kind of floats above the body. The engraving is so bad that some even suggest it's deliberate. A deliberate clue pointing to Shakespeare not being the author of these works. A clue that not all is as it seems here. But this isn't generally accepted by scholars. There is just one other likeness of Shakespeare that is a carved effigy at his burial site at the Holy Trinity Church in his hometown of Stratford-upon-Avon. Again, it's kind of a mediocre work, but since it was the official effigy created for Shakespeare, it must have been at least an acceptable likeness to those who knew him. The only catch with this one is that it was also installed in 1623. The only difference is that the artist Gerhard Jansen had lived near the Globe Theatre and may have seen Shakespeare in real life. But that's not exactly a glowing recommendation for fully capturing his features. This effigy was also repainted in 1749, leaving no trace of the original colors. So even that is erased from us to use today. I use the Chandos portrait for my recreation simply because it lives in our collective consciousness, and I think that if Shakespeare did privately commission a portrait of himself, it would have matched these descriptions and it would have been from around this time. So let's take a look at some possible likenesses of the great writer now. Before I go, I wanted to share another exciting project I've been working on. Once again, Royalty Now and Kleio have teamed up to recreate the fragrances of history, and this one is all about Shakespeare. We called this new candle A Midsummer Night's Dream because it takes inspiration from this, one of Shakespeare's most celebrated plays. Something fascinating is that the candle includes scents that Shakespeare would have been familiar with in his lifetime. It's such a beautiful candle, guys. Please go check it out over at Kleio.Global. Thank you all so much for watching. Please check out the Etsy store for prints and bookmarks of your favorite subjects, and of course leave your comments down below for future people you'd love to see. And we will see you all for the next video.